John Carruthers-Green, Chris Jackson, welcome back. It's the same sort of format as the last episode of Speaking of Steel, but we're back today to talk about developments at British Steel and particularly the UK steel market, the repercussions. John, you've been in demand this month talking on this very subject. I mean, we're focused on prices, but all sorts of conversation. Just quickly, how's that gone for you? Because there's been quite
that was really interesting, actually. It's not very often that we get asked to do press interviews, but then about 10 all at once. We had Trump and his tariffs. We've got British Steel all coming at the same time. So steel's actually sort of hit the news headlines, and because of that, we've been in big demand recently.
No, it's great. It's great that we're able to share our insight, because the research is happening every day.
Yeah, that's what we're here for.
These markets, excellent, and that's what Speaking of Steel is here for as well. Chris, British Steel in particular, I gather you previously worked there many moons ago before your time at MEPS. Is there a bit of a personal side to this development in recent weeks?
Certainly so, Tom. Firstly, thank you for the invitation again. And yeah, you're perfectly right. I think, as John mentioned, steel has been hitting the headlines. I guess that's globally and obviously within the UK as well. And you're right. British Steel is a place that's actually quite close to my heart. I'm a former employee of Tata Steel, and now they're under the guise of British Steel. And certainly, I think having a feel of having worked there, you get a clear indication of how important the site is to the local area. It's certainly Scunthorpe is synonymous with steelmaking. There's a lot of pride, a lot of history, heritage to the steelmaking in the town. And interestingly, the plant does dominate the skyline, not just in Scunthorpe, but for very much of North Lincolnshire as well. So again, being a former employee of the site, you certainly get a feel of how important steelmaking is to the site. And obviously with the recent trials and tribulations, it obviously put a little bit of a black cloud over the site. But I think it's obviously a situation where people are a little bit more at ease, having the UK government having paved that way for nationalisation.
Well, that's certainly what we're here to talk about today. We did ask someone from British Steel to come and join the podcast today, remotely or in the studio. Quite understandably, they're rather tied up with the practicalities of steelmaking at the moment and securing the future of the site. We have got an interview with UK Steel's Gareth Stace, however, so he'll reflect on the UK steel industry and the importance of this development for British Steel towards the end of the podcast, which should be really interesting. In the meantime, I guess to add a bit of context, understand for those viewers that might not be fully aware of recent developments. John, can you sort of bring us up to date? What exactly has been happening with British Steel at Scunthorpe, and where are we now?
Okay, so the Scunthorpe plant's got a very long history, but let's start 2020 when Jingye took over the plant. They brought it back from insolvency, and they essentially sort of took over operations there. Jingye, being a Chinese company, were hoped at the time we're going to bring some of the expertise, bring over some of the demand, bring over some sort of a new insight into the company. Almost immediately, though, there were sort of plans talked about to shut these blast furnaces, and Jingye actually sort of announced officially that they were looking to shut the blast furnaces in 2023. What happened then, though, was they had a very clear and obvious plan, was to shut the blast furnaces and replace those with 2 electric arc furnaces. Made absolute sense at the time. What we've seen, though, since then is that these plans have been sort of stepped back a little. There have been a few issues with regards to the sort of the size and the scale of the furnaces that could be built there. Maybe issues with the actual planning and practicalities of it. Then when we come to 2025, we've come to just 2 months ago, we got the announcement from Jingye that what they were actually planning on doing now was shuttering the blast furnaces without any intention of transferring to electric arc furnace. So they actually put all of the employees working there on consultation with the intention that there could be thousands of job losses. And this really brought what was a sort of a slow winding story right into a sort of national importance. And this is why we found that the government's actually sort of stepped in. So early April, over the course of basically one weekend, the UK government writes some new legislation saying that they can take control of British Steel, take control off Chingye, and they're not going to say nationalise it, but we're certainly sort of halfway there. They've actually sort of written new legislation so that the government can take control of it. And now essentially what they've done is they brought in a new CEO, they brought in a whole new team that's running the plant, and they've had to sort of start taking sort of financial, taking over the financial side of running the plant.
So, John, British Steel clearly came very close to the brink. How much were the UK government pressured into making this move?
There was a lot of pressure making this move. It was something that they basically had to do, otherwise these furnaces were going to be going out. The consultation would have happened, and we would have been looking at the closure of the site. I suppose one of the questions that we've been asked a lot recently is how keen were the government to do this? And I think this was very much a last resort thing. I think they'd be much happier for British Steel to remain in private hands. I think for the rest of the UK industry, they'd be very, very keen for it to stay in private hands. One of the questions that we've been asked a lot recently is if it happens here at British Steel, could it happen somewhere else? I mean, Liberty is obviously, it's got a very sort of troubled past as well. And I've got to go back to that same point. I think ideally, the government would like to stay out of the industry as much as possible. They'd like to provide that support. They'd like to create an open environment for private business to thrive. I don't think long term they want to be steelmakers.
And Chingye, as you know, we should point out, are still very much the owners of British Steel and own other British Steel plants around Europe, which the UK government won't be able to have an influence on. So I guess now that relationship has to be very carefully managed. It's become a political issue, hasn't it?
Definitely a political issue. I think certainly this year we found that with all of the larger global sort of trade troubles, with all of that going on in the background, with the new government trying to sort of impress voters, trying to keep some kind of steel primary production in the UK, it has become very political. And I think that's why it's sort of bled across from industry news into the actual headlines on the papers.
Yeah. And just quickly, I mean, you mentioned there the fact that Parliament reconvened and brought this legislation through very, very quickly, as it turned out. You know, the sort of the deadline was dictated by delivery of raw materials. Is that right? And it sounds like
so that
was a real operational headache at the last minute.
Yes, it was very much a practical. There were practical reasons for doing it so quickly. There was worries at the time that the blast furnaces were going to be let to cool down, and obviously there's issues trying to refire those and keep those running. So that's why the government stepped in very quickly to do what they did. There was reports that Chingye were quite happy to let these blast furnaces cool. Like I say, they'd already put the consultation notice saying that they were intending on closing them, and it was really because that was going to happen in such a short amount of time. That's why the reaction from the Labour government was so quick and so decisive.
Yeah, and the outcome now is that the consultation on redundancies has effectively ended.
So that's been cancelled now, yes. Yeah. So the intention now by the government is to keep those furnaces operating, certainly for the foreseeable. However, you know, looking 1, 2, 3 years further ahead, I don't think there's any clear intention for what's going to happen then.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, we previously mentioned, you know, you previously worked for the British Steel business. a long time before before joining MEPS, clearly. But this development is hugely important for the town of Scunthorpe, indeed, the UK steel industry as well. How important is it from a supply point of view to both domestic steel customers and those in mainland Europe as well?
Yeah, certainly so, Tom. I think firstly you touch on there obviously the vital importance and the strategic nature of the site itself. I think obviously there's a direct impact through the steel supply chain. There's a lot of companies in the local area at the front end and the back end who are reliant on the health of the steelworks, and they will breathe a bit of a huge sigh of relief that the plant is still operating. And even the tertiary industries in the local area as well, whether that's sort of maybe hotels, local businesses, obviously thriving steelworks is one that, again, that's clearly important to their own businesses and generally the health of the local economy there. In terms of the customer base, I think again UK buyers of steel will obviously welcome the government's development there to keep British Steel operating. I think people see the merits of a local domestic supplier. There's obviously good technical commercial links. I think people welcome the opportunity to buy flexibly and at short notice from a local and domestic source. In view of going down an import line, I think you obviously have the bureaucracy, you have the material handling, and arguably, obviously, trade legislation that's in place at the moment. So I think people see the merits of a healthy, thriving domestic steel industry, of which British Steel is a key part. In terms of their product portfolio, obviously they produce sections for the construction sector, and a lot of the material that comes from there you will see in a lot of the iconic buildings and bridges around the country and maybe around the world as well. And certainly in terms of their rail production, they have a very close association with Network Rail. So again, there's a vital importance there in terms of UK infrastructure, which again is coming into short focus, obviously with the HS2 project as well. So the sort of viability and the importance of the site cannot be questioned domestically. I think on the flip side of that, in mainland Europe and around the world, I think it's fair to say that people maybe utilise British Steel as another buying option for them. British Steel, I think by their own admission, will face challenges in overseas markets. Obviously, in light of Brexit, UK steelmaking is subject to European Union quotas. So again, that's something they have to be mindful of, which does obviously limit their footprint in Europe. In Asia, I think it's fair to say that British Steel will find it hard to be competitive, and that'll be across sections, across their wire rod portfolio. I think they're coming up against fierce competition from low cost steelmakers, and you probably tend to find British Steel will target high value niche products away from the general commodity scene. And obviously it's quite well versed in North America at the moment that British Steel, like all global steelmakers and global exporters, are now subject to the 25% tariff on steel and aluminium. And from the recent research we've done, I guess not just British Steel, but other traditional suppliers into the US are finding it's increasingly difficult to serve their US customer base. So domestically, obviously UK buyers will welcome the recent developments. Maybe the impact is a little bit more negligible in the global markets, but again, people welcome that opportunity to buy and that alternative source of material.
Yeah, I think you sort of highlighted something there, Chris. I think domestically, people can probably see the benefits of domestic steelmaking, the quick, hopefully reliable supply of products. But I guess that viability issue at British Steel has been ongoing for some years, and clearly cited by Jingye in their approach recently. John, is there a sense that this site can remain viable, can be a success? And if not, there's real question marks over the UK government's investment, isn't there?
There is going to be some serious questions for the next few years. We saw reports. We saw a statement in Parliament just yesterday by the business secretary, suggesting that they'd spent £94 million already. So what's that, in about 3 weeks, keeping things running? Obviously, they had to buy a lot of raw materials with that, but still, that kind of gives you an idea of some of the money that needs to be spent to keep this running. I think long term for the UK, the original plan of converting to electric arc furnaces was honestly really the only way that we could have kept British Steel viable. Trying to keep the blast furnaces open, trying to do that with the additional costs that are associated with all the extra people that are going to be working there. I think it just makes the company so uncompetitive. Certainly when we're looking at these high energy costs as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting John says that. I mean, the problems in terms of the cost base are not a new problem. The challenges that the company on the Scunthorpe site has faced, possibly generation after the generation, there's long been an argument that they have struggled to be competitive, arguably at home and in foreign markets as well. The cost factor is obviously a symptom of relatively high labour costs, relatively high input costs as well, an argument about business rates and also high energy costs as well, principally born from arguably electricity. So adding all those components into the mix, I think British Steel and other UK steelmakers have found it very difficult to retain their competitiveness, particularly in global markets away from those local domestic customers. And it's an interesting argument at the moment. I know there's been a focus principally on retaining the viability or sustainability of the blast furnaces. I think there's an argument, obviously, if British Steel were to close, and obviously they were taken a little bit from the brink, then the UK would be the only G7 country that haven't got the facility to make virgin steel. And the merits of virgin steel is that it's able to produce material for buildings, for infrastructure, arguably with fewer imperfections than recycled steel.
Increasingly for defence now as well, I guess, Chris.
Increasingly for defence as well, and that's maybe a trend that we're starting to see, not just in the UK but around Europe as well. I know when sites are unfortunately maybe suffering financial issues, whether that's bankruptcy, insolvency, maybe coming back onto the market, I think governments around the world are now taking a closer focus, naturally, in terms of world events, that they want to make sure that the sites are in the hands of companies who obviously are reflective of that national interest, national security. And you're tending to find in Europe that a lot of sites now will certainly need government approval before a sale is finalised, or maybe in the instance that we've seen in Czechova in Poland,
yeah,
that's actually coming under the guise of a state-owned entity, but under the umbrella, if you like, of the Polish Ministry of Defence. So naturally, there's a look not just towards energy, but defence and security is obviously a key argument as well. I think on the flip side of that, I think obviously there's a focus on the blast furnaces, but I think there's almost another school of thought as well, as John mentioned, that obviously there is a growing trend towards greener steel making. There's certainly a wide acceptance for whatever site to retain their competitiveness and viability, that they will need to transition to electric arc steel making. And there is an argument for that at British Steel. I think the site is very much volume driven, and this is maybe part of the reason behind their loss-making capacity in recent years. But if and when they move to electric arc steel making, then they can obviously slim down, have the facility to maybe switch the steel making on and off to an extent, and maybe target high value niche products away from that commodity driven agenda. So there's two schools of thought, but obviously with the latter, that will obviously come at the expense of the blast furnaces and will unfortunately result in quite hefty job losses and obviously a significant outage if and when a transition is made.
So what do we know, John, about the future plan moving forward from this immediate sort of firefighting stage just to keep the place going?
Very little. That's what we know right now. I think the immediate problems are those of, like you say, of keeping the furnaces lit, of keeping those orders going out. That's the primary concern of the government now. Looking a bit more long term, I don't think any decisions have been made yet. If we're looking at keeping these blast furnaces firing, then just like Chris says, it's going to be something that's going to require ongoing investment by the government. It's something that we're going to have to accept that we need to pay for via sort of general taxation. It's like I say, it's cost us 100 million already. It's going to continue to do that. So I think it really comes down to how we see British Steel going forward. Is it something important enough for us to keep subsidising? Is it something that is of national importance that we keep that primary steel making? Or is it something that we try and look at as perhaps a viable business, certainly when we're looking at a cleaner, greener steel, and maybe transitioning to electric arc furnaces? That's certainly sort of a decision that Tata made in Port Talbot. And that question, that still remains for British Steel.
So we've already mentioned the supply, clearly, Chris, but how important is the supply from British Steel for the UK? You know, the products it produce, are they essential to the market? And if they are, then what influence might we see on prices of either production ramping up or, you know, potentially going away?
Certainly the products are critical. As we sort of mentioned earlier, a lot of material produced from the site is going into critical infrastructure, whether that's rail or particularly into buildings and construction. I think typically British Steel and again other continental steel makers have faced very challenging and difficult trading conditions at the moment. I think demand in a lot of steel using areas has been weaker than anticipated. I think there's obviously been a level of economic uncertainty in the UK. The cost of borrowing has been relatively high, and I think there's an argument that while interest rates are coming down, people would like to see that cost of finance come down quicker, maybe give a little bit of relief, and obviously give people a confidence to invest and place orders again. I think from a UK buyer perspective, I think everyone sees the merits in a thriving, healthy domestic steel scene. But I think what we've seen, not just with British Steel, but also with the Liberty Group in the UK and arguably Tata on occasion, I think UK buyers have questioned obviously the viability and sustainability of UK steel making, which has arguably become very fragmented in recent times. So I think people have looked to continental Europe. They have looked to global sources for alternative sources of steel, and that may continue to be the case unless UK steel making is on a firmer footing. So the intervention of the government in British Steel's case has brought a little bit of time, maybe a little bit of relief to British Steel and to the domestic consumers who buy from domestic sources. But I think the challenges are not new, but again, they will not be resolved overnight, and it may not just need the supply side of things. I think there's an argument in the UK and across Europe that people are craving for long-standing and sustainable demand, which has been absent in recent times, but will be required for the health of not just steelmakers, but the steel industry in general. And it has been interesting in recent times that the Labour administration have been looking through the UK Steel Council, the US Steel Charter, to actually promote and send a made in Britain ethos, I guess similar to the made in America standpoint that we've seen in recent times, and again try to encourage when landmark projects are up for tender that UK origin steel is used, and that will hearten the likes of British Steel, Seltzer, Tata, and the likes, that there may be opportunities there. So I think I think if those opportunities do come to fruition, I think again that puts the shining light on domestic steel making, that everyone wants to see it thrive and develop.
Well, I think those things that you've just spoken about are right at the heart of the priorities of the Trade Association UK Steel. So I'm sure Gareth Stace will be keen to explore those when he has a quick chat with us as well as part of the podcast in a few moments' time. I guess, John, that supply and demand dynamic is central to sort of import safeguard issues in the UK as it is in Europe. The UK is still awaiting decisions on revisions that will come. The Trade Remedies Authority are working on those as we speak, I believe. So how much of a bearing does British Steel's future, and indeed I guess that of Tata Steel and other UK producers, have on the decisions that are going to be made in the coming months on import safeguards in the UK?
So with regards to it's interesting you mentioned UK Steel, because it was their submission that kicked off this latest round of consultations on the safeguards. I suppose the changes that we're going to see are really going to be reactive, depending on what happens with British Steel and with Tata. The whole point of these measures is that they protect or safeguard the UK steel industry, and obviously there's been some really big changes over these past 12 months or so. One thing I would say though is, in their current format, safeguards, there isn't much time for those to be still be applied. So we essentially inherited our safeguards from the EU ones. So I believe the sort of the start time is the same. So 2018. Then we look at that maximum 8-year period. We're looking at June next year, which just keeps getting closer and closer, doesn't it? So whatever changes will happen will only have an effect for, say, the next 12 months or so. I think what we've got to see is some kind of plan beyond that. That's certainly sort of what we've seen talked about in Europe, and if the UK government is going to sort of follow through with this sort of keeping the UK steel industry alive, they're going to have to do something very similar.
Yeah, so we're looking at a longer term plan, and I guess until that supply side consideration from domestic steelmakers is very settled. I mean, Tata feels pretty secure in its plans, but that really will determine the lay of the land when those new rules come into place. Okay, so in terms of imports going forward, Chris, do you think, are they still very much on the agenda, or will people quickly start looking more domestically as we've said, steel becomes more strategic?
I think that's a natural consequence. Yes, Tom. I think naturally, in recent times, you've seen an air of protectionism, I guess, between trade barriers raised in all corners of the world. I guess most publicly in the US, but I think a lot of people are very keen to obviously protect their local and domestic market share at the expense of foreign competition, but then invariably they have an eye on maybe selling their surplus material, their surplus stock to traditional export markets as well. So again, in those import-export dynamics and maybe the recent review of the TRA, I think there's a delicate balance to be struck. I think UK buyers and consumers will have a degree of concern in terms of UK steel making, maybe the recent issues, the recent problems, and again the challenges that the steel makers face in terms of cost challenges, are not going away. So I think UK stockholders, UK traders naturally will want import options at their disposal as well. So it will be interesting to see if and when any changes are made by the TRA, because that balance is like I said, is a very delicate one to ensure a thriving domestic steel scene, but also ensure that people in downstream markets and consumers of steel do have the necessary buying options at their disposal. Yeah,
absolutely. So, as I said, things that we did explore in conversation with Gareth Stace when I spoke to him in an interview, which we're going to take a quick look at now. Gareth Stace, Director General of UK Steel. Thanks ever so much for joining us today to discuss not only the future of British Steel and recent developments, but also reflect on the implications for the UK steel sector as well. I guess by kicking off, could you start by just reflecting on why British Steel's Scunthorpe plant is so important for UK steel making and domestic supply chains?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And thanks for having me on your podcast. And I'm really keen to get across the importance of British Steel to the wider steel sector in the UK and demonstrate that each steel company in the UK doesn't stand alone. It's part of the sector and an integral part of that sector. And British Steel is, as I said, no different to that, because if in the worst circumstance we would have lost British Steel or its ability to make steel a few weeks ago, we would have lost some vital products for our sector. You know, we know that British Steel make sections, rail, and wire rod, and without those products going into our construction sector, I believe that would have a knock-on impact on the wider steel sector here in the UK. So we're really supportive of what the government has done to step in that historic moment when they recalled Parliament on Saturday for the first time since the Falklands War, and then that following Monday that Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, took control of British Steel, of the organisation, and appointed Alan Bell as interim CEO. And that was all very welcome for us because it gives us hope for the future of British Steel and certainly for the future of the UK steel sector.
It does feel like a lot of the actions that have been taken so far, were firefighting measures really, and a lot of unprecedented things unfolded in Parliament as you suggested there. But what is now the near and sort of medium term outlook for the British Steel operation in Scunthorpe?
It certainly was firefighting, Tom, wasn't it? It was reactive. You know, if we think of what happened in Redcar in October 2015, and that wasn't reactive enough. You know, we were warning government at the time then when Sajid Javid was business secretary saying, look, if you don't step in and save that blast furnace, they will just turn it off, it will cool, and then that's it. That blast furnace at Redcar will be gone. And that's what happened. And it was only a few months after that Anna Soubry, as business minister, said to me, we should have taken a breath then, and we could have done something different. And that's exactly what Jonathan Reynolds did. They took a breath. They understood the implications of letting those blast furnaces cool, and then they're finished. So what do we need to see now looking forward? We need government to be searching as quickly as possible for an investor into British Steel to buy the plant. You know, nationalisation may be a short-term solution, but I don't believe it'll be the longer-term solution. But you know, if nationalisation needs to happen, then again, we as UK Steel would support that in the interim to find a longer-term buyer. But what do we really need? You know, you could find an investor to buy British Steel, but what would they be buying? They would be buying into a sector in the UK that still operates with an uncompetitive business environment where, for example, energy costs here are still 50% more than steel companies pay in France or Germany. It makes us uncompetitive. It hinders our ability to sell our products here in this domestic market, in Europe and globally. And so we need government not only to support capital investment in our sector, but to support delivering a competitive business environment so we can compete in a home market. And why is that important? Because what we've seen in the last 2 years is imports surging from something like 50% of UK steel demand to now an alarming 65% of UK steel demand in the UK is met by imports. That is unsustainable and unacceptable. So a forthcoming steel strategy from the government, published, I hope, in the next few months, I know needs to deliver that competitive business environment so we can compete and start taking back market share that we've lost to those imports.
So, I mean, we've talked about the steps already taken by UK Steel and particularly the competitive environment that British Steel will still operate in. But do you foresee that government intervention will be required in other steel producing businesses in the UK?
Well, I certainly believe that the steel strategy, what it needs to do, it's got a few jobs. It needs to look at future demand for steel in the UK and see where that rises and where it, for example, in offshore wind, we're going to need something like 25 million tons of steel for offshore wind over the next 25 years. That's a really important market for us. So the other bit, to answer your question, Tom, is we need to look at, have we got the capability and the capacity to meet that future demand? And where are those gaps? And where also might there be, gaps in terms of our capability, but also not just today, but in the future? And therefore, helping government understand where that investment of that £2.5 billion that the government is saying it will invest in our sector over the next 10 years, where that money is best spent.
Okay, so I guess that leads us nicely on to UK Steel's other priorities right now. We're aware at MEPS that there are considerations about adjustments to the import safeguard measures, and clearly that the success of the wider steelmaking industry in the region. Where are your priorities now? What do you say? It's quite a broad church, isn't it?
Yeah, and our priorities, and we're telling the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, in no uncertain terms what those priorities are. And I've talked about energy prices already. I've talked about a surge in imports and what to do about that. And so in trade policy, we want to see the government continuing to talk to the US administration to deliver the exemptions that we enjoyed to its Section 232 25% steel tariffs. We want that to happen. At the moment, we're paying 25% tariffs on all our exports into the US market. That needs to change. But we also need government to be aware of all the steel that's floating around on the global market that may come here. And so to strengthen our trade defences in the UK by tightening the tariff rate quota within the steel safeguards, but also look into what government is going to do to put in place in trade policy and trade defences once safeguards cease to be in June next year, in June 2026. They cannot continue. So government has to put something else in place to tackle global overcapacity and a surge in imports. We also want government to purchase more of the steel that it buys, given it's the biggest purchaser of steel in the UK, more of the steel that it buys from us as steel producers here in the UK, and not, which it currently does, is buy a third of the steel with taxpayers' money from abroad. And then we also want government to look at raw materials as we shift from 2 of the companies making steel with blast furnaces and 4 of the steel companies making steel via the electric arc furnace route, with them all making steel via the electric arc furnace route. They will need a lot more steel scrap, and therefore we're in a very fortunate position here in the UK because we sit on an abundance of that raw material. We produce or generate in the UK economy something like 11 million tons of steel scrap, but we export 80% of it. So we need to use more of that steel scrap here in the UK to produce that steel via the electric arc furnace route, and we can do that. Or we just need to work with the steel scrap companies, the scrap merchants, but also saying to government, do we know where that 80% of scrap exports go to? Do they go to countries with an environmental record that's not as good as ours? And if that's the case, then shouldn't government be asking those countries to uplift their environmental protection so they're on par with us? And if they're not, we believe that government, and certainly for non-OECD countries, should be restricting those exports to those countries because they don't have the same environmental standard as us. If we're preaching at home that you've got to have strong environmental standards, then we should also be doing the same when we export our materials into those economies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, an awful lot of legislation consideration, but also I guess we need to ensure that the economic conditions are right as well for the domestic steel making industry in the UK as well, by the sounds of things.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that steel demand. If the economy picks up in the UK, that economy will be needing more steel for that improvement in our economic performance. But as I said, we commissioned a company called Lumen EE, who are specialists in offshore wind. We commissioned them to write a report that would demonstrate how much steel is needed for the future offshore wind market. And why did we do that? Well, because to date, how much steel that is made in the UK is in that offshore wind sector that we have in the UK, and we know that the answer is zero. And so we know that there's a big opportunity for delivering steel into future offshore wind projects. And as I said, something like 25 million tons of steel is needed over the next 25 years. And that is a huge opportunity for our sector. So what we need to do is understand, well, why didn't they purchase any steel from us in the past? And how can we change that to ensure that the majority of that 25 million tons of steel is purchased here in the UK, is fabricated here in the UK, and therefore is delivered to those projects using indirect and direct taxpayers' money.
Absolutely, Gareth. It sounds like you've got your work cut out at UK Steel, but plenty of development opportunity there for the sector. Plenty of scope for improvement in the economy at the moment. Let's hope they come together and produce a positive future. Thanks ever so much for joining us on the Speaking of Steel podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and hopefully you can join us again sometime.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much for your time. Thanks, Gareth. Okay, guys, thanks ever so much for joining me for another excellent episode of Speaking of Steel. Really insightful, and I think, a really good roundup of the UK steel sector, and hopefully a little bit of insight into the future of British Steel. All that is backed by MEPS research for the European Steel Review, which you guys are engaged in. So thanks, John, for your
Tom.
insight. Thanks for sparing time from your other media commitments. And Chris, thanks for taking a step back from the research coalface and sharing your insight as well. It's been good to have you.
No, thanks, Tom. Thanks again for the invitation, and very nice to speak something that's very close to my heart. Yeah, thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys.